just to delve a little bit more into the trip to BYU, I don't know that we could find a team across the country, a program across the country that would uh, receive more diverse feedback in regards to how good the program is, whether they actually play Power Five football or they're more of a group of five, because there's schedules all over the place. I break down these schedules every year across the country. And when I get to BYU's schedule, I always call it the strangest schedule in the country because they load up on a lot of really good opponents the first month of the season when everyone's playing non-conference games. And then you can tell it's difficult for them to find opponents after that when they were an independent.
Mm-hmm.
So they can go from playing some of the best teams in the country to 2 weeks later, they're playing Wagner and they're playing Utah Tech, and they're just trying to fill out a schedule. Well, we've arrived at a different place now. They're in the Big 12. But to look at how they've fared against Power Five teams at home might be an interesting exercise at some point. I'm looking at 2022. Actually, I'm looking at one of my favorite sites. It's got historical scores going back to the beginning of time, but they have not filled in 2022. So by memory, they hosted Arkansas this year. It was a good game for about three quarters. They got blown out in the fourth quarter. They lost by 17, 20 points, something like that. They beat Baylor at home in overtime this past season. So there's a connection to the Big 12, and they beat a decent team. Baylor, of course, was not as good this past season. The year before in 2021, they hosted Utah, who eventually won the Pac-12, and they beat them by 9 points at home. They beat an 8-5 Arizona State team by 10 points at home. They went on the road and lost to Baylor by 2 touchdowns. They went to USC and won, but that was a bad USC team. The season before in 2020, they didn't play any Power Fives because of the messed up schedule. 2019, they hosted Utah. They lost by 18. They went to Tennessee and won against an 8-5 Tennessee team. They beat USC, who finished 8-5. They beat them by a field goal at home. They lost to Washington at home pretty decidedly. So they've not been dominant at home by any stretch against the Power Five, but they've been extremely respectable in taking on good Power Five programs and holding their own at home.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think Oklahoma has a lot of uh, a little bit of negative history with BYU. You know, Oklahoma. It was a game that actually happened in at the Dallas Cowboy Stadium, which I think not only did Oklahoma lose the game in which they were a fairly heavy favorite, but that was the game where Bradford got knocked out of the game as well. So I think there's a little, not that there's bad blood or anything like that, but I think there's some um, obviously that game comes with some negative feelings and some negative thoughts. But no, I mean, I think your point is well taken. BYU is one of those teams that, yeah, I would agree. They kind of they kind of, I think, float in people's mind between what a Power Five team looks like and what a Group of Five team looks like, because as you mentioned, excuse me, they've played and they've beat several of these Power Five opponents and teams. So I think they are set up in such a way that they will be able to be very successful early and often. Now, I mean, the schedule may take a little bit of a toll on them in terms of continuously playing the Power Five opponents, over and over again. I mean, as you mentioned, they have Arkansas again this year, which they travel to Arkansas. But other than that, they go to Kansas, to TCU, to Texas, to West Virginia, and then they host Iowa State and Oklahoma, and then go to Stillwater to end the season. So it'll be very intriguing to see not just BYU, but I think that's the team that probably comes to mind along with Cincinnati. I mean, I'm sorry, yeah, along with Cincinnati as teams that have had a lot of recent success. Not that Houston hasn't, Not that UCF hasn't, but I think, with Cincinnati making it to the college football playoff last year, and BYU being very successful over the last few years, over and above, what you would expect maybe as a group of five team, that they'll have the opportunity to come in and be very successful this first year.
Yeah, it's an interesting four. You've got BYU, who historically helped usher in the passing offense in college football, but of course, that's ancient history. That's 40 years ago. You also have BYU being the one outlier of a national champion in the last 40 years, winning a national championship as an undefeated team in 1984. But since then, they've been a good program. A lot of 8 and 5s over the past 30 to 40 years for BYU.